everyone, and welcome to a new month of Patreon content. This month I am bringing you a half slip pattern called the Sweetheart Slip. And I'm really excited about this. I love the idea of half slips. I feel like more people should wear them. They've sort of gone out of fashion these days, but they make so much sense. So if you think about like our Stanwyck pencil skirt, you really need something underneath it to keep from catching on your stockings, reduce static cling, add a little layer of warmth and opacity. But if you're going to line every dress you make, think about it, it kind of wastes time, wastes money, and it wastes fabric. So I feel like the half slip is just a great, like, money-saving, eco-friendly alternative to lining every dress and pencil skirt you make. Mr. Jingles is saying hello. So let me tell you a little bit about the pattern. It is a bias cut slip and it has a pencil skirt shape to it. So you're going to learn a lot of new skills today, hopefully. What I like about this project is that it's very skill building in terms of lingerie. And I know you all are interested in lingerie and sleepwear. So this is going to introduce you to that world and give you some great new skills, like cutting fancy fabrics like charmeuse, working on the bias, sewing a beautiful picot elastic waistline, doing French seams, which I'm really excited about, and doing this beautiful scalloped lace hem. Okay, so I'm really excited to just dive right in and start talking about supplies, so let's get going. All right, let's talk supplies. So I know that lingerie sewing can be a little intimidating in terms of the supplies you need because you need to source some, I wouldn't say unusual, but you need to source some items that you may not have in your everyday arsenal. So I'm going to give you resources for all of these items in the instructions, but I also just want to say, like, really have fun with this part of the process, because what I like about sewing lingerie is that you really get to have fun with color combinations, mixing up different saturated colors of silk with different colors of lace and elastic. And so just kind of go crazy, because the fun thing about this is you can have a beautifully couture slip that no one in a store will ever be able to buy because they only sell them in white and black nylon now. So think of this as your entree into high-end lingerie sewing. All right, so let's talk about fabric first. I'm going to be using silk charmeuse today, and I would really recommend, if you have the opportunity to get some silk charmeuse, that you give it a shot, because it's a great skill building thing to get used to working with this kind of slippery fabric. If you don't want to use silk, you can certainly use a synthetic. Silk crepes are good too, synthetic crepes. And then if you're on a budget and you're looking for something that you may have around the house, a lining fabric could work well too, a synthetic lining fabric. So I'm going to be using this silk charmeuse in this beautiful turquoise color. And then you're going to need some lace for your trim. So I recommend looking for a lace that has scallops along the top and the bottom. So you can see this beautiful nude color here, which is what I'm going to pair with my turquoise charmeuse. And then I also have on hand this lovely white, and then a black one as well, which is wider. So what you may notice is that these are all different widths. And the great thing about this pattern and these instructions is that it doesn't matter what width lace you use, okay? It can be anywhere from 1/2 inch to 9 inches wide. So play around with it. It doesn't matter. We're going to place it in the same way and then trim away from behind, so it doesn't matter what width you use. All right, so once you've picked out your silk and your lace, then you're going to want thread to match both of them, okay? So an all-purpose poly thread is great for this sewing project. So I have one in nude and one in the turquoise. And then you're also going to want some picot edge elastic. Now this is a lingerie elastic. You can get it at places like Joann's, but you can also order it from specialty lingerie sewing retailers. So it has a flat area down here that should be about 1/4 inch, and then above that it has this little scalloped edge, and that's what's going to stick out above the waist of your slip for a really delicate decorative finish. So you need enough of this to go around your waist snugly. So anywhere from 3/4 of a yard to 1.5 yards, depending on what size you wear. All right, so and then here's another one. I just wanted to show you the difference in what different picot edge elastics may look like. So some of them are very subtle, and then this one obviously has a more dramatic picot edge. All right, so that's your picot edge elastic, and then some supplies you're going to want to have on hand. I know I've said in the past that I don't really like duckbill applique scissors, but I found them really handy for this project. They have the duckbill side over here and then a regular sharp embroidery scissor side over here. They help you trim away from things like when you're trimming away the silk charmeuse from the back of the lace. This duckbill edge helps you avoid cutting your lace, which obviously you don't want to do. So those are really handy. If you don't have those, you can just use like tiny little embroidery scissors are fine for that part of the process. And then of course your regular cutting shears you're going to need too. Needles for your machine. This is really important. You can't just plop silk charmeuse into your machine using whatever needle is in there and you haven't changed for the last, let's be honest, how long has it been? So you're going to want to get a new needle for this, and you're going to want it to be a microtex needle, and the smallest one you can find is usually good for a fine silk like charmeuse. So I have a 68 size here, but 70-10 would be good too. All right, and then the last thing I want to tell you all about is tissue paper for cutting out your silk. I cannot recommend enough having tissue paper on hand for cutting any slippery fabric like crepe, lining, Bemberg, all of that stuff. So this is really handy because we're just going to put a layer of it over our cutting table and it's going to stabilize the silk, and it makes it so much easier to cut. So I bought this huge roll of tissue paper from South Star Supply, and I linked to them in the resources. It's huge. It was $50. It's going to last me my entire life because there's so much on here. But if you don't want to buy a huge roll of this, you can use sheets of gift wrapping tissue paper. You can use medical supply tissue. Whatever you have on hand or you can source easily is totally fine as long as it has a tissue texture. Even if you have an old sewing pattern that you're not going to use, one of the 99-cent ones you got at Joann's or something like that and you don't want it anymore, you could use sheets of tissue paper from sewing patterns to do this. So don't stress about getting the specialty tissue paper, just have some sort of tissue paper on hand. All right, so those are our supplies, and next we're going to talk about cutting out your slip pattern pieces. All right, let's get started cutting. So the first thing I've done is I have laid out a single layer of tissue paper on my cutting table. So just roll it out and just have it covering your table. Next thing I'm going to do is take my silk or whatever fabric you're using for your silk, for your slip, and then lay it out on top of the tissue paper. And you'll see as soon as you start laying it out that the tissue paper kind of grips onto the silk and it doesn't slide around like it would without the tissue paper. So if you have any major wrinkles in your fabric, you'll want to steam them out. These are just sort of little creases from it being folded. So I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. All right, so once you're happy with your fabric laid out on the table, next you're going to grab your pattern. And I want to talk a little bit about this pattern. The great thing about it is there's only one piece. The front and the back are both cut from the same pattern piece. But there are two different grain lines. There's a grain line for the front and a grain line for the back. The reason for that is when you're working on the bias, you want the front of the garment and the back of the garment to be cut out on perpendicular bias grain lines. If you have them both cut out on the same bias grain line, it creates this kind of twisting grain that goes around the body, creates twists in your slip, and it can also make your side seams uneven. There's Henry begging for lunch. So you want to make sure that you're following these grain lines. And by that I mean, when you cut out your slip front, what you're going to do is follow the grain line that says slip front grain line, and you're going to position that so that it is perpendicular to the selvage of your fabric. And then when you go to cut out the slip back, you're going to turn it this way, the pattern piece this way, so that now the slip back grain line is perpendicular to the selvage, okay? So now that we've got all that out of the way, let's look at a couple other markings on the pattern piece. You have notches, which I want you to clip into, not too far, just about 1/4 inch on the side seams. And that's really gonna help you when you're sewing your bias seams to get them to match up. And also I would recommend transferring this circle at the top here because that denotes your center front or your center back. And that's going to help you with matching up the elastic to your waistline. Okay, so let's talk about actually pinning and cutting. Okay, so let's do the slip front first. And I'm just going to give you a couple tips for pinning and then cutting. All right, so you're gonna position it like this so that your front grain line is parallel to the selvage. And then you're gonna want to grab a measuring tape or a long ruler. So you would want something that is long enough to reach this grain line. I can also align the short edge there and make sure that this other grain line is parallel to the ruler. So that's one thing you can do. But what I want you to do when you're cutting is to use a measuring tape or a long ruler and measure from the selvage to one end of the grain line, and then measure from the selvage to the other end of the grain line, and make sure that the grain line is the same distance from the selvage on both ends. And that means it's perfectly parallel to the grain line. So after you've done that, you're going to pin your pattern piece in place. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is that silk is very susceptible to permanent pin marks. So I like to just pin in my seam allowances. And you're going to pin through the pattern piece, through the silk, and then through the tissue as well. Okay, so just go around like this. And just make sure you grab all of those layers with your pin. And as I'm doing this, I will just say that I know a lot of people prefer using a rotary cutter for slippery fabrics, just because you don't have to actually pick up the fabric as you're cutting it. You can keep it flat. And that's totally fine if you prefer to do it that way. I am just really used to this kind of old school way of using pins and my shears. It's just my preference. So whatever works for you, you can do it that way. Okay. And then you're going to actually cut. So I am going to kind of create a little starting point for myself here because I'm kind of off the table. And you're just going to start cutting with your shears through the tissue and the silk around the edge of your pattern piece. And if you've never used tissue before, I think you'll be really excited about how much easier it makes cutting and how much more accurate your pattern pieces are going to look after cutting with tissue paper, because it just really stabilizes everything and gives you a nice, perfectly cut pattern piece. So I'm going to finish cutting around here. I'm going to snip into my notches, transfer my circle, and then I'm going to cut my back by using this grain line like we talked about. Okay, so do all of your cutting, and then we're going to be ready to start sewing. Okay, everyone, I thought you would want to see Henry briefly because I know he's been jingling around, so I just wanted to make sure that you were able to see him today. And I also wanted to tell you that he has an Instagram account now that he shares with his sister Hattie. So if you want to follow Hattie and Henry on Instagram, they are Henry and Hattie H on Instagram. So daily pictures of this cutie. All right, Henry. I think that's everything for you now. You can you sit quietly? Okay, so now that that's done, we're going to talk about sewing your French seams. So I did want to mention that you can see my 2 pieces are cut out here. And now that we've cut them out, there's nothing to differentiate them from front to back. And it doesn't really matter, is the thing. So you don't need to mark front or back, but there is going to be a point in the process where we press the seams both towards one side, and that will end up becoming the back. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that up front. All right, so you're going to take one piece and put it wrong sides together with the other piece at one side seam. What we're going to do is sew one French seam on one side first, then we're going to do the lace because we'll be able to lay it out flat, and then do the other side seam. Okay, so for a French seam, which is a beautiful enclosed seam that's used very often on lingerie, high-end lingerie like we're making, you're going to put these wrong sides together and then pin along one side, matching your notches. And I'll just say up front that it's going to feel really weird. So if it feels like you're doing something wrong with the French seam, then you're probably doing it right. I still have moments when doing a French seam where I panic and think that I've put the incorrect sides together. But if it feels wrong, it's right. I also wanted to mention that you're going to have extra tissue copies of your pattern now since you cut the pieces out on top of tissue. So I am going to use those later to stabilize the lace, but it's also nice if you want to just save them so that you have duplicates of your pattern. That's always a nice thing to have, especially one that you're going to be cutting twice. So the next time you can mark one your back and just use that as your back pattern piece. So you have one for the front and one for the back, but you don't have to. Just a thought. All right, so now that I'm pinned, I'm going to take this to the machine, and I'm going to sew this side seam at 3/8 of an inch, not our full 5/8 of an inch. All right, 3/8 of an inch. So let's head over to the machine. Let's sew our first French seam. So you're going to put it in your machine and just make sure that these raw edges stay aligned. And again, we're sewing this first seam at 3/8 of an inch. So if you're not used to finding that on your machine, you can measure from your needle over to the guide mark over here to the right. We're going to start stitching. Oops, I'm on a basting stitch. Go down to a regular stitch length, about 2.5 is good. I'm going to back stitch, and then we're just going to sew this seam at 3/8 of an inch. Take your pins out as you go. Now we're at the top of the skirt. Okay, and next thing we're going to do is trim this seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch. So about like that. Okay, so just real carefully and you can see I'm using a slightly lighter thread here so you guys can see it show up on camera, hopefully. So just continue trimming all the way up the seam, and then we're going to go to the ironing board and do a couple pressing steps. I like to do a 4-step pressing process with my French seams, and I'm just going to show you on this little area right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is press the seam flat just to set the stitches and make the fabric more pliable for the following steps. So just to get it nice and warm. And I'm using a low heat here on silk, by the way. All right, now the next thing I'm going to do, step 2, is to press this open. And it's a little tricky because we only have an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to work with here. But you want to get in that seam allowance with the point of your iron and press it open. And the reason for this is just like any other seam that we press open, to get it to look nice and crisp on the right side of the fabric. It really helps give you a beautifully pressed seam to press it open. All right, and at this point, you can check on the right side of the fabric, or this would be the wrong side of the fabric now, just to make sure that your seam line is looking nice and pressed and there are no weird wrinkles or anything there. And now the next thing we're gonna do, step 3, is to press the seam allowances to the side, to one side. It doesn't really matter which one. And this step is in preparation for step 4, where we are going to put right sides together, just like we would sew any other seam, and press this flat. And what I want you to do here is look at that seam line and get it nice and rolled out right to the edge, okay? You don't want it to be off at all. So just roll it out and then press this nice and flat. And then the next thing we're going to do is pin this in preparation for sewing the seam a second time at 1/4 inch. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is sew at 1/4 inch, which will enclose that little 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and give us a perfectly enclosed seam. All right, so now we're ready to sew the second line of stitching on our French seam. So now that you've done all that beautiful pressing work, we are going to sew this seam again at 1/4 inch. And use your regular stitch length. Just take out your pins as you go. Finishing up here, I'm just going to back stitch. All right, so if this is your first French seam, congratulations. It's pretty magical. What you'll see here is that you have a perfectly enclosed seam allowance right there. And on the right side of the fabric, you shouldn't see any little threads or anything. If you trimmed your first seam allowance to an 1/8 of an inch, you won't see any evidence of it here. So the next step is to press this to one side. So I'm going to use my seam roll again. And it doesn't matter which side you press it to, but you should know that whatever side you press it to is going to become the slip back now, okay? Because both side seam allowances get pressed towards the seam back. Slip back. I think I keep calling it a skirt too. I kept doing that when I was writing the instructions. I kept saying skirt back and skirt front. So if I say that, you know what I mean. All right, so press it to one side. That's now the back. And I would just be really careful. Just make sure that you don't have a weird fold right here. And also, if you start to see like an impression from your French seam on the right side, which is really common because it's now, you know, a little bit thick there, what you can do is really concentrate just the point of your iron on the stitches like that, instead of pressing the entire seam allowance flat and then getting an accidental impression on the right side. Okay, so I'm just going to continue pressing this. Then we're going to go over to the table, and then it's time to lay out our lace, which is my favorite part. Now we're ready to place our lace on our skirt. And I did just want to mention a few things about the way I have constructed this today. As I mentioned, I'm leaving the second side seam open. We're going to apply the lace and then sew the second side seam. The reason for this is it's just a more beginner-friendly way to be able to place the lace completely flat and sew it completely flat rather than in the round. The disadvantage is that your lace is going to get caught in the side seam, which isn't a huge deal if your motifs match up on the lace at the side seam. But if you have, like, say, a narrow point on the lace and then a high point at the lace matching up at the side seam, it doesn't look great. So if you can't get this to work, I will say you can sew your second seam and then place the lace in the round, overlap the ends, and see if you can get that to work. Or your last resort would be do it this way, but you can leave a slit on the side seam up to the second notch so that the lace doesn't actually meet, and it leaves sort of, you know, a lot of slips have slits in them, so it looks period appropriate and slip appropriate. So that would be, Henrik, please, that would be your next option. But I'm going to show you this way for now because it is the most beginner-friendly way to do this if this is your first time working with lace applique and lingerie techniques. And it does look great if you can get the lace to match up too. Okay, so here, I don't know what's underneath there. Okay, here is my lace laid out on the hem of my skirt. So what I'm looking at first is what's happening at the raw side seam edges over here. And what's happening, the way I've laid it out here is that they're both at a narrow point on the lace, so I know that they're going to match up. And I did that just by kind of, you know, moving the lace around a little bit. Another, you know, advantage to being flat right now is that I can kind of move this around and get it to my liking in terms of placement. And I found that what I like is if I have both sides, oh, now I've lost my carefully placed lace placement. Now I want them to both be at the most narrow point of the lace. All right, so let me just mess around with this for a minute again. I think I can live with that. So the next thing you want to look at is where the scallops are meeting the raw edge of the hem. So I like to have see how the scallops dip in? I like to have that lowest point of the dip meet the raw edge of the slip right here. And then that gives me the scallop underneath the hem, sort of dipping down below the hem. All right, I may need to fuss around with that a little bit more, but moving on. The next thing you're going to do is take some strips of your tissue paper from your cutting point in the process and lay it underneath where you're going to pin the lace. So we're going to be using this tissue paper to stabilize while we're sewing the lace so we don't get puckering on the silk. All right, so now you can pin through all the layers. I like to place a pin sort of at the bottom here and then at the top part of a lace motif like this, and just stabilize it all the way along the hem like this. Okay, so I'm just going to continue like that. I'm going to put another strip of tissue underneath this side, and then we'll be ready to take this whole thing over to the machine and sew around the upper edge of the lace. Okay, we're ready to sew the lace to our slip. So I've just taken the whole thing over here with the tissue paper underneath. And I should mention, I've changed my thread color here. You'll want to change it so that it matches your lace now, not necessarily your slip if you're using a contrast lace. Okay, and you want to set your machine to a zigzag stitch. And it should be pretty narrow, so like 1.5 millimeters would be a good width. and then 1.5 to 2 would be your length. Okay, so tiny little zigzag. All right, so what we're going to be doing here is zigzagging along the upper edge of the lace. So depending on how intricate or plain your lace is, this is going to be very different for you. If you have a very intricate lace, you're going to be zigzagging around a lot. If you have a straighter scallop, then it'll be relatively easy. So mine's I have a dramatic sort of like rise and fall on mine. So I'm just going to take it really slow. And I'm going to start stitching on one end. It's very important to like keep everything nice and flat here. And actually, I want to go just like a little bit narrower on my zigzag. All right, there we go. All right, and you should be stitching on the lace itself, right at the upper edge. And you're gonna have to take this really slow. If you have a machine with a knee lift, that's a really nice feature to have. Mine doesn't, but my machine at the studio does have a knee lift, and it was really nice sewing these samples with the knee lift. Okay, so if you want to pivot, make sure your needle is down. And just kind of pivot when you need to. And the cool thing about this technique is, you should be starting to see it happen already, is that the zigzag just blends in with the lace and makes it look like it's sewn on invisibly. So it's a really cool technique. It does take a little while. I'm going to keep stitching around this upper edge, keeping everything nice and flat. And then the next step will be to tear away that stabilizer on the back. And once you kind of get into a groove a little, you might not need to pivot quite as much. You can kind of curve around and steer your machine a little bit. And you'll get the feel for it as you get going. Okay, so after you're done stitching around your scallops, next thing we need to do is tear away the tissue paper and then trim away the silk from behind the lace. So I will just say there are other things you can do here, and I did it on the blush slip with the black lace, is that if you have a really wide lace, you can find another motif below this to do a second line of stitching and then cut behind that one. That's a little more advanced, but I did just want to mention that as an option because you will see that on one of my samples. Okay, so what we're going to do is just tear away the tissue paper from the back, and it will get stuck in the stitching. So what you're going to have to do is just tear away. I'm just going to work in this small section right here. Tear it away as cleanly as possible, but you're going to have little bits stuck in your stitching. So what you can do is go back with a pair of tweezers and just pull those out. It doesn't have to be right now. It can be at the end, but you can get them all out. Okay. So once you've torn away your tissue paper, the next thing to do is to trim away the charmeuse, leaving the lace intact. And this is where these duckbill scissors work really well. So I'm going to have the duckbill go underneath the layer, the first layer of the charmeuse, but not catching the lace at all, and trim as close as possible to that zigzag stitching. And this is the step where you really want to take the most time and care, because you don't want to accidentally cut through your stitches or through your lace. And you want to trim it nice and close. Like that. And then just continue around this way. So what this is going to give you on the right side is a really beautiful effect with no fabric behind the lace and then seeing it trimmed away around the scallop shape of the lace. So the zigzag will keep your fabric from fraying on the inside, and you just need to keep working away at this and just give yourself some time to do this step. And then the next step is going to be sewing the second side seam and then the waistband, the elastic waist, and we're done. So you have sewn your second side seam now after you finish trimming away all of your charmeuse behind your lace. And I did just want to say, on your second side seam, because you're going to be catching the lace in the seam, just be really careful with ironing. Because I melted some lace myself this week, I am now super paranoid, and I didn't even touch the lace with my iron this time. So I was really just finger pressing when I got down to the lace, and then pressing as usual, our little 4-step process for the French seam above the lace. Okay, so that's just a warning. But now you have a beautiful sewn slip that just needs a waist band, elastic waist, or picot edge elastic. So you're going to grab your picot edge elastic and you need to cut it to your custom length for your waist. So you're going to put it around, I've already cut mine, but I'm going to show you how I did it, the smallest part of your waist, and then it really needs to stretch. So don't think that you're going to like give yourself some breathing room with this, because then it's just going to bag off, and it's going to be more comfortable once it's stretched, and it's going to hold on a little tighter. So you really want to stretch around like this and then have a 1/2 inch overlap. Okay, so it should look about like that. All right, so really you want it to be stretchy. Don't try to make it loose and comfortable, because it's just going to get baggy and kind of fall down. All right, so, and it still will be comfortable, by the way. All right, so the next thing you're going to do is overlap the ends of the picot edge elastic by 1/2 inch. Remember, you just gave yourself 1/2 inch to work with. And we're going to zigzag these ends together. So I'll just put a pin right there. And I have changed my thread color back to blue to do my side seam. And I'm going to keep it on blue now so that you'll be able to see it. But you can choose, because your stitching is going to be visible on the skirt. So you may want to match your thread to your skirt, but if you want it to contrast and match the elastic, that's fine too. So you're going to put this on a zigzag stitch again. With this one, I would go like 2.5 wide by 2.5 long. So it's like a nice square zigzag. And stitch in that smooth, flat part of the elastic, not on the picot. And here you can backstitch to reinforce, stitch your overlap, and then backstitch again. Okay, so it's not very pretty, what we have here, but it should do the job of holding the elastic together when worn. Okay. Ooh, my back looks kind of crazy because my bobbin got a little caught there. So if I were doing this, I would probably redo it, but because we're filming right now, let's just keep going. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is stitch the elastic to the skirt, to the slip. But first you need to divide the elastic and the slip waistline into quarters. And then you're going to match those quarters and then distribute the ease from the slip into the elastic. So it'll make sense. So the back is where I zigzagged, and then opposite that on the elastic would be the front, the center front. So I'm going to put a pin right there. And then on the sides would be my side seams. So I'm dividing this into perfect quarters. Now on the slip, you already have these marked because you have your circle marks at center front and center back, which should match your center front and center back on the elastic. And then you have your side seams, okay, to mark the side seams. So you are going to put the picot edge elastic so that the right side is facing down on the slip waist like this. And you want the raw edge of the skirt to be matching the finished smooth edge of the elastic. So what you're going to do is put a pin at every match point. You're going to pin these two together. So you're going to see between the quarters, there's going to be a lot of slack on the skirt, which is what we want on the slip. On the slip. You could make this as a skirt if you really wanted to. Some people like lingerie as outerwear. All right, and then this messy bit, ugh, so terrible, is going to match our center back. And then our second side seam. Okay, so what you should have now is the elastic pinned in 4 places to the skirt. And we're going to do our first stage of zigzagging, which is zigzagging the elastic to the skirt. Then there'll be a second stage where the elastic gets turned inside the skirt, and then we top stitch zigzag on the right side of the skirt. Okay, so you can start, I would recommend starting at center back. And I'm going to make my zigzag just a little wider. And what we're going to be doing here is stitching on the elastic, and you want your left side of the zigzag to be just next to the picot edge, but not on it. And then the right side to be on the right side of the flat part of the elastic. Okay, so this, you got to take this slow. Again, what's tricky about this part is you need to pull out the elastic to get it to match the skirt, the slip, and then you're going to zigzag the two together. So I like to hold it kind of from the front and the back. And you kind of need to keep pulling it out like that, pulling the elastic out. And you can kind of stabilize it by pulling from behind as well. Stitch the end of that. And then again, I'm going to grab where I've pinned my quarter mark, pull it out. And if that's too much slack that you're pulling out, then you can kind of divide that in half with your right hand. Just hold on to it with your fingers. And then keep going in small increments like that. What can happen with the slip is that slippery fabric will try to kind of creep away, and you'll find you won't actually be stitching any fabric underneath there. So you need to make sure that these two edges stay flush with each other. Okay. And take your pins out when you get to them, of course. And make sure that your side seams, your French seams, stay pressed the way that you want them to towards the back of the skirt. And just keep going around like this. right, I just finished the last quarter of the zigzagging. So I now have one step of this elastic waistband done. And the next thing we're going to do is turn this in again. So you're turning the elastic to the inside like this. And now we're going to stitch on the right side. And you can trim away any excess at the end. If you have a little elastic bit like this, it doesn't fray, so you can trim away like that. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is kind of flip this to the inside. You don't need to press it. You can if you want, but it's not necessary. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to zigzag again, but on the right side. And I like this fold right here on the skirt, the slip, on the slip. I like it to be just to the inside of the opening on my foot. So you can kind of test this out. I'm starting at center back again. So just about like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue zigzagging, pulling the elastic out to stretch it again. And this stitching is obviously going to be visible. If you prefer, you can use another type of zigzag stitch, like a 2 or 3 step zigzag is really common on lingerie. But I wanted to show it on just a plain old zigzag, just in case that's all you have. Okay, so see how I'm aligning that fold of the charmeuse with the inside of the presser foot so that my stitching is going to be right next to the fold. And then I'm using my right hand to pull the elastic out in front and my left to hold it stable in the back. Just keep going around like this. And just take it nice and slow. You don't want to rush this part because, again, it is visible. I just met up with where I started my stitching, so I'm going to end there. And then there's really just one final step, which is to steam this. So get your iron out, and I'm going to need to wake it up again, and have it on a high steam setting. We're not actually going to touch the elastic or the silk. We're going to be sort of hovering above and steaming. And the reason for this, it's kind of like when you do elastic shirring with elastic thread. When you sew it, it gets kind of stretched out of shape. And now we're going to kind of shrink it back up. I really like this part. It's very fun. So you need to make sure you have some steam going. Let me give it just another minute, because you don't want to do this too soon or you will leak water all over your skirt, which I've already done today, over your slip. Okay, so I think it should be ready to go now. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to like hover here, and you can see my skirt, my slip. it's a skirt now. You can see my slip starting to constrict up back to the elastic's original shape. See how exciting? And there we go. So that's your finished slip. So you see how lovely the picot edge looks, and then your beautiful lace on the bottom and your French seams. So these are all really lovely high-end techniques. I will say there are some alternatives to the picot edge if you just can't stand how it looks on the inside, which has always bothered me a little bit too. You can use fold over elastic, which completely conceals the edge, would be a nice alternative. Or you could sew a waistband on and make a flat casing for the elastic. So there are some other things that you can do if this really bothers you, but I think it looks really beautiful from the outside. And all of these techniques and the materials are in line with some really high-end items I saw when I was researching this project. If you look for slips in silk with Chantilly lace like this, I'm not kidding you guys, they will be like $300 to $600. And there's some really beautiful high-end French designer lingerie items out there. I'm going to share some of those with you, especially one video that I really became enamored with, one designer called Corinne Gilson, who does gorgeous French lingerie. So what I'm saying is, I hope that these techniques and these materials really inspire you to do more lingerie style sewing. So I hope that you have loved this month's project, and I will see you next time.